Let me start with this. If this stings a little, stay with me for 10 seconds. If you're always the kind one, the understanding one, the one who gives one more chance, there's a chance your kindness isn't being honored, it's being harvested. I want to say something that may feel uncomfortable, but truth often is. Kindness, when it has no boundaries, stops being kindness. It becomes access. And toxic people don't see your kindness as love. They see it as an open door with no lock. I've watched this happen again and again. You give the benefit of the doubt. You explain away bad behavior. You say, they're hurting. They didn't mean it. If I'm just patient enough, they'll change. And slowly, quietly, you start abandoning yourself. Not because you're weak, but because you're wired for connection. Here's the danger. No one talks about toxic people don't need to break you. They just need you to doubt your right to say no. They use your empathy against you. They weaponize your compassion. They count on your fear of being seen as selfish, cold, or unloving. And the hardest part, you don't even realize it's happening because it doesn't feel like control at first. It feels like loyalty. It feels like being the bigger person. It feels like love. But love does not require self-erasure. Love does not demand silence in the face of disrespect. And kindness that costs you your safety, your dignity, or your peace is not kindness. It's self-betrayal. If you've ever felt drained, confused, or guilty for wanting distance from someone who keeps hurting you, I need you to hear this. Clearly your kindness is not the problem. The lack of boundaries around it is. Let's go deeper, because this is where it really starts to hurt. Toxic people don't show up wearing warning labels. They show up wounded, charming, misunderstood. They tell you their story. And because you are kind, because you have a heart that feels deeply, you listen. And in that moment, they study you. They notice how you flinch at conflict, how quickly you apologize even when you've done nothing wrong. They notice that you care more about harmony than honesty, and that's when the shift happens, not loud, not obvious, but subtle and strategic. They test your boundaries in small ways first. A sarcastic comment you brush off, a broken promise you excuse, a moment of disrespect you minimize because you don't want to seem dramatic. And every time you let it slide, they learn something dangerous. Your kindness is negotiable, but their comfort is not. Here's the truth: we avoid empathy. Without discernment is self-harm. When you constantly explain someone else's behavior instead of addressing its impact, you teach them they don't have to change. You'll do the emotional labor for both of you. And slowly, your kindness becomes a leash. They pull it when they want forgiveness. They yank it when you try to pull away. They remind you of everything they've been through, everything they've suffered, until you feel cruel for needing space. You start asking, am I overreacting, instead of why am I being hurt? You start shrinking your needs so they can stay comfortable. And the most heartbreaking part, you confuse endurance with love. But let me be very clear, love does not require you to tolerate manipulation. Compassion does not mean you surrender your voice, and kindness is not an obligation to stay in relationships that wound you. The moment your kindness is used to silence you, it's no longer a virtue. It's a vulnerability being exploited. Let me tell you why being nice feels safer than being honest. Because somewhere along the way, many of us learned that honesty costs us connection. We learned that setting boundaries leads to rejection, anger, or abandonment. So we chose niceness, not as a virtue, but as armor. Niceness says, I won't upset you. Kindness says, I won't abandon myself. Toxic people thrive around niceness because niceness avoids conflict. It smooths things over. It pretends everything is fine while something inside you is quietly breaking. And when you're nice, you don't challenge, you don't confront, you absorb. You tell yourself it's not worth the fight. But what you're really saying is my discomfort matters less than their reaction. And over time, that belief becomes a cage you live in. Here's where control tightens. The moment you try to be honest, really honest, you're met with guilt, defensiveness, or emotional punishment. They withdraw angry. They remind you of all the ways you've been lucky to have them. And Your nervous system learns something fast, honesty is dangerous. So you go back to being agreeable. You go back to explaining, softening, over-functioning. Not because you're weak, but because your body is trying to keep you safe. But safety built on silence is not safety. It's survival. And toxic people don't need to raise their voice to control you. All they need is your fear of being misunderstood, your fear of being labeled difficult, ungrateful, or unkind. Let me say this slowly, because it matters. Discomfort is not harm. Someone being upset with you is not abuse. And setting a boundary does not make you cruel. It makes you clear. When you choose honesty over niceness, you may lose people who benefited from your silence. That loss hurts. But what hurts more is losing yourself piece by piece while calling it love. Let's talk about guilt, because guilt is the sharpest tool toxic people use on kind hearts. Guilt is quiet, persuasive, and devastating. It doesn't scream at you. It whispers, after everything I've done for you. When you're kind, guilt hits harder. You feel responsible for other people's emotions. If they're upset, you assume you failed. If they're hurting, you believe it's your job to fix it. And toxic people sense this immediately. They lean into it. They remind you of their sacrifices. They replay their pain. They bring up the past at exactly the moment you try to set a boundary. Not to heal, but to hook you. And suddenly, your simple request for respect turns into a courtroom where you're the one on trial. You start over-explaining, over-apologizing. You negotiate your needs down to nothing, just to stop feeling like the villain. And here's the trap: the more guilty you feel, the easier you are to control. Guilt keeps you available when you're exhausted. It keeps you quiet when you're hurt. It convinces you that leaving, saying no, or pulling back is a moral failure instead of an act of self-respect. But guilt is not the same as accountability. Accountability says, I can hear this and still take care of myself. Guilt says, I don't deserve care at all. Let me be clear, you are not responsible for managing someone else's emotional world. You are responsible for your integrity. And sometimes integrity looks like disappointing people who benefited from your self-sacrifice. A boundary will often trigger guilt, not because it's wrong, but because it disrupts a dynamic that worked in someone else's favor. That discomfort is not a sign to retreat. It's a sign you're reclaiming yourself. If guilt rises when you choose yourself, don't ask what's wrong with me. Ask who benefited when I didn't have boundaries. Exhaustion is not just being tired. Exhaustion is what happens when your soul has been overdrawn for too long. And kind people, deeply kind people, are often the most exhausted because they keep giving without receiving safety in return. You wake up already tired, conversations feel heavy. You replay interactions in your head, wondering what you could have said differently, softer, better. Not because you're obsessed, but because you're carrying emotional weight that was never meant to be yours alone. Toxic people normalize this exhaustion. They call it love. They call it commitment. They say relationships are hard while you're the only one doing the emotional lifting. You're the one calming storms you didn't create. You're the one translating disrespect into understanding. And here's the danger: when exhaustion becomes familiar, you stop recognizing it as a signal. Your body is waving a red flag, but your mind keeps saying, just try harder. But love should not feel like constant depletion. Kindness should not require self-neglect, and connection should not cost you your nervous system. Exhaustion is not proof that you care deeply. It's proof that the relationship lacks reciprocity, that your kindness is flowing in one direction, that you're pouring into a container with a crack in the bottom. And when you finally slow down, when you say you need rest, space, or change, you're often met with resistance. They get offended. They accuse you of pulling away because your exhaustion disrupts their access to you. Listen closely. The moment your healing threatens someone's comfort, you're no longer in a mutual relationship. You're in a dynamic built on your depletion. Your fatigue is not a personal failure. It's information. It's your body saying, this is not sustainable. Here's something that doesn't get said enough. Toxic people don't fear your anger. They fear your clarity. The moment you stop explaining, justifying, or begging to be understood, the ground shifts beneath them. When a kind person starts changing, it feels like betrayal to someone who benefited from their silence. Your boundaries feel sudden to them, even though you've been drowning quietly for years, and that's when the panic sets in. They might accuse you of being cold. They might say you've changed as if growth is a flaw. They might bring back old versions of you. The more agreeable you, the more available you, and try to guilt you into returning. Not because they miss you, but because they miss access. This is where many kind people fold, not because they don't know the truth, but because standing your ground feels terrifying. You worry you're becoming someone you don't recognize. You worry you're hurting them. You worry that choosing yourself means becoming unloving. But here's the truth: clarity feels cruel only to those who thrived in confusion. Boundaries feel like rejection to those who relied on your compliance. And notice this: when you become clear, you don't actually say more. You say less. You stop over-explaining. You stop defending your needs. You let your actions speak. And that silence, that's what unsettles them. You are not required to convince someone to respect you. You are not obligated to stay where your worth is debated. And you do not need permission to outgrow dynamics that harm you. Standing your ground will cost you relationships built on your self-abandonment. That grief is real. But what you gain is something far more powerful: self-trust. One of the biggest fears kind people carry is this: if I protect myself, I'll become cold. So instead of building boundaries, you build walls, or worse, you leave everything open and call it love. But protecting your kindness does not mean killing it. It means directing it with intention. Your kindness was never meant to be given indiscriminately. It was meant to be offered where there is safety, reciprocity, and respect. When you give it to people who exploit it, you don't become more loving, you become more depleted. Here's the reframe that changes everything: boundaries are not barriers to connection, they are the requirements for it. Without them, what you have isn't intimacy, it's exposure. Toxic people confuse access with closeness. Healthy people understand that closeness grows when both people feel safe enough to be real. And safety does not exist where your no is punished or ignored. You don't need to explain your boundaries to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You don't need to announce them with anger or defend them with evidence. You simply live them, and yes, some people will fall away, not because you stopped being kind, but because you stopped being convenient. Kindness with boundaries looks like this: you listen, but you don't absorb. You care, but you don't chase. You empathize, but you don't excuse harm. This is not hardness. This is wisdom. Your heart doesn't need to close, it needs discernment. And discernment is what allows kindness to remain a strength instead of a liability. Choosing yourself comes with grief, and not the kind that shows up quietly. This grief is loud, it stings. It rattles your bones. Because when you finally stop bending for someone else, when you finally protect your time, energy, and heart, you realize you're letting go of people who were central to your story. And that hurts. You love them. Or at least the version you hoped they could be. You invested years in kindness, patience, and emotional labor. You carried the weight of their moods, their mistakes, their crises. And now, when you step back, that weight lifts, but the absence feels like a loss. Here's the hard truth: this grief is not regret. This grief is not proof you failed. It's proof that you are human. Proof that you allowed yourself to care. Proof that your heart is big enough to love deeply and brave enough to finally protect itself. Toxic people rely on that grief. They know it can pull you back in. They know the H of missing someone can be stronger than the clarity of boundaries. And that's why you need to honor your feelings without letting them dictate your actions. Cry if you need to. Feel the ache. But do not give it away. Healing is never painless, and leaving people who harm you, even subtly, is never easy. But staying where your kindness is exploited is far worse. That path slowly erodes your soul while disguising itself as loyalty or love. You must give yourself permission to grieve and grow at the same time. Mourning what you lose does not mean forfeiting your right to be safe. Protecting your peace does not make you cruel. It makes you alive. Now let's talk about recognition, because toxic people are rarely obvious. Their manipulation is subtle, like water slowly eroding rock. They know exactly how to slip under your radar and exploit your kindness without raising alarms. It often starts as charm. They notice how much you care, and they wrap themselves in vulnerability. They tell you things meant to pull on your heartstrings, not to build trust. They test you with small asks, favors, emotional support, extra time. You give, because your empathy refuses to let anyone struggle alone. Then the pattern deepens. A passive-aggressive comment here, a missed promise there, a guilt-laden appeal when you hesitate. And because your focus is on keeping the peace, you forgive, explain, or justify. They are training you to comply quietly over time. Here's the key: pay attention to your body. That subtle tightness in your chest when you say yes one more time. That small voice in your mind asking, am I really okay with this? Those are signals, not inconveniences. That's your intuition protecting you. Notice the imbalance. You give energy, time, and care far more than you receive. You feel drained after interactions instead of uplifted. That's not love. That's leverage. That's control disguised as connection. Recognizing these patterns is not cynicism, it's survival. It's not about labeling someone bad. It's about seeing reality clearly so you can decide where your kindness belongs. Your generosity is sacred, and when it's exploited, it's a crime against your own soul. Here's the truth, and I want you to feel it deep in your chest. Your kindness is a gift, not a liability. It does not make you weak. It does not make you naive. And it certainly does not obligate you to endure exploitation. You can be fiercely kind and still say no. You can be tender-hearted and still protect your energy. You can love deeply and still refuse to be manipulated. The world doesn't reward boundaries in the same way it rewards compromise, but your soul will thank you every single day. Reclaiming your kindness means reclaiming your life. It means you get to choose who deserves your attention, who earns your empathy, and who will never again treat your generosity as a door left unlocked. And in that choice, you will discover something miraculous: freedom, clarity, and self-respect that feels like sunlight warming every part of you that was once shrouded in doubt. It's not easy. It will rattle relationships and upset expectations. But kindness with boundaries is not just sustainable, it's transformative. It teaches people how to treat you without sacrificing who you are. It preserves your heart while amplifying your love rather than depleting it. So if you leave this moment with only one idea, let it be this: being kind does not mean being available to abuse. Being generous does not mean being invisible. Being loving does not mean being a doormat. Protect your heart fiercely, and the right people will feel honored to step into your life. Your kindness is powerful. Guard it, direct it, and never let anyone convince you that caring deeply requires giving yourself away. This is your call: love boldly, yes, but wisely.